Hey everyone, I want to welcome you to this Maundy, Thursday, Holy Week Unveiled. And I want to share just a sermon I was going to have this week, today, on Maundy, Thursday. And it's a story sermon. It's not a typical sermon, so don't just click on it now and get off. At least give me a few minutes, all right? So here it goes. Maundy, Thursday is about this Last Supper, a man who's the Son of God, and a meal with his disciples. And so today we're going to hear or meet the owner of the upper room, and we're going to hear a first person account of what he may have been thinking as Jesus and the 12 went up to the upper room. Your Bible doesn't give me a name, but this story really isn't about me. It's about a man and a meal. I lived in what you now know as the first century of Jerusalem. It wasn't bad to live in Jerusalem. Apart from the Roman occupation, the city was thriving like never before. Herod the Great had transformed the city since no one since the great Solomon had. He built palaces and citadels, a theater, an amphitheater, bridges, and monuments. While all of it had been done to increase the capital's importance in the eyes of Rome, we citizens of Jerusalem didn't fare too badly. Now, granted, there were people in the city who were more financially secure than I was, but my family and I, we were doing just fine. We lived in the southwest corner of the city, a neighborhood known for its limestone 1 and 2 story houses that sat almost on top of each other, and for its winding dirt streets and alleys. While it wasn't the richest part of town, like some of the spots here in Knoxville, it wasn't the slums either. The great thing about our neighborhood is that I was able to work where I live, and I lived where I worked. In fact, one of the unique characteristics of our community is that we lived with those with whom we worked. We built houses together. We even had our own synagogues where we would go to hear the scriptures read and taught. Our neighborhood was what you might call today a blue-collar community. We were weavers, dyers, potters, bakers, tailors, carpenters, metal workers, and olive grove farmers. And we had plenty of work to do, especially during the Great Feast. You see, there was times, 3 times a year, our city would grow from its normal population of about 20,000 people to well over 100,000 people for an entire week. From all over, my fellow Jews who lived outside of Jerusalem would come to town. They had no choice. Jerusalem wasn't just a thriving center of commerce, but it was the heart of the entire Jewish world. If you had visited my city for the first time and made the difficult ascent from Jericho as you rounded the Mount of Olives, you would have been dazzled by the sight of one of the most glorious structures ever resurrected, the temple. The gold and gleaming structure was the heart of the city. For that matter, it was the heart of God's world because it was God's dwelling place. And 3 times a year, these other Jews who didn't live there had to make a pilgrimage home to worship and celebrate there in God's city during one of our religious feasts. Well, it was springtime. One of the most important feasts of our faith was about to get underway. If you know much about our people, you know about our history with Pharaoh and Moses and our exodus from Egypt. You may also be aware of the night that God dwelt the final blow that would cause Pharaoh to let us go. God was going to send an angel of death to kill every firstborn son throughout the land of Egypt. But he told us that if we would slaughter a lamb and take its blood and mark our doorpost, we would be spared from this horror. That night, after God carried out his terrible sentence, Pharaoh was so upset that he demanded we leave. So we left so fast, we didn't even have time to let our bread rise. So every year after that, we celebrated those events. We remembered God's mercy and deliverance by again telling the story and participating in those same actions of slaughtering a lamb and making bread without leaven. It's become a feast called a Passover feast, or the Feast of Unleavened Bread, as it's sometimes referred to. And it's one of the most important feasts of our people. That year was no different than any other. There was an enormous amount of preparation to be done. No other festival requires the work that Passover does. The first thing we have to take care of is make sure that there wasn't even the tiniest amount of leaven in our home. The house had to be cleaned upside down and cleaned extensively, a place or a practice which, interesting enough, would later be known as spring cleaning. Because our utensils, crockery, and cutlery had been used during the year and had come in contact with leaven, we either had to have a separate set of dishes kept or for the feast, or our utensils and cookware had to be koshered, meaning rendered fit by dipping them into boiling water. The night before the feast, one last thorough search of the house was done, and any food with leaven that was found was burned the next morning. The house was ready. I don't know whether you stay up whenever you're preparing for a holiday to get ready, but we had been up late trying to make all of our final preparations. The lamb was to be purchased the next day. We already calculated the exact amount needed for our family, for Jewish law mandated that the lamb that day not be wasted or left over. It all had to be eaten. We'd been up only a few hours the next morning when two men began approaching our home with one of our servants who had gone to retrieve water. They looked familiar, and then it hit me. I'd seen them just a few days earlier in the temple court. I'd gone up to worship and pray as I did on a regular basis when all of a sudden this guy comes out of nowhere and he starts flipping over tables of the guys who are selling doves for sacrifices and exchanging currency. As some scurried loose coins, as some scurried after all the loose coins, I couldn't take my eyes off of this guy. There's something different about him. He began teaching and I was amazed. His message was one I had never heard before. And these guys, the ones coming up to my house, they were there by his side. I know it was them. As I stepped up to the door, they said to me, the teacher asked, "Where's my guest room where I may eat the Passover of my disciples?" Your teacher wants to have the Passover in my house? I was speechless for a moment and a bit confused. I'd never actually met him. How did he know I was so amazed at the temple? Was my reaction that obvious? Had he had someone follow me to know where I had lived? No, that didn't seem possible. But how these guys known to follow my servant with me when I wasn't with him that day? The whole thing was spooky. I'm not even sure what I said, but the next thing I knew, I was walking them through the house, showing them the room that we already set up for our family for the evening meal. When I finally got the nerve to ask these guys, who introduced themselves as Peter and John, how this had all come to be, they said, Jesus does this kind of thing all the time. He had this knowledge about people and he could see things and know things, not to mention things that no one else, do things that no one else could. They hadn't even figured him out yet. After they'd gone out and purchased enough lamb for their party, we moved on with the preparations of the day. I wish I had more time to tell you about these guys. Whoa, I mean, talk about characters. That's another story. We were just finishing putting the meal on the table when my son came running up the stairs to tell me they were here. I've been preparing for this moment all day long. I can't tell you how glad I was we had thoroughly cleaned the house when we showed up. From the moment he walked through the door, it was as if this purity and holiness filled our room. It was hard to put into words, but in some strange way, I was warm on the inside and yet had goosebumps at the same time. The hairs on the back of my head stood up, or the neck stood up, and I knew when he greeted me that there was something different about this man. I showed him to the upper room where he and his disciples could eat. And I started leaving, and he called me by name. I want your family to join us. He didn't have to ask twice, eat with him. I couldn't be more honored. I went downstairs, I got the kids and my wife, we went up and reclined for the meal. I was accustomed to leading the ceremony and readings for the feast, but not that night. I wanted him to have that honor. After he began the feast, when it came time when a child typically asked questions about the meal, as had been the custom for centuries, he turned and looked across the room at my son with love in his eyes. His disciples seemed a bit shocked, and they all grew silent when he, with a loving nod, signaled to my boy to proceed with the traditional questions. My son, with a confidence that I at the moment would not have possessed, asked the questions that had been asked for centuries. I'd never seen a teacher of his caliber treat a child with such love and dignity. The festivities of the evening continued. The conversation around the table was lively. The appetizers and wine had been served, and the main course was now on the table. He hadn't said much throughout the evening. In fact, on a few occasions, I was certain I saw him wiping tears away from the corner of his eyes. In the brief moment of silence, with everyone's mouth full, he spoke. I tell you the truth, looking around at the 12 who were gathered around him, one of you will betray me, one who's eating with me. You could hear a pin drop. Suddenly, everything came to a screeching halt, and one of his disciples inquired, "It isn't I, is it?" It's one of the 12 who dips the bread into the bowl with me. Well, they had all been dipping bread into the bowl. There's a bowl of stewed fruit in the center of the table. It was typical for you to dip bread and even your meat into it. They all stopped dipping and eating as he continued. The Son of Man will go just as it is written about him. But woe to that man who betrays the Son of Man. It'd be better if he had not been born. Go? You just got here. You just showed up in Jerusalem. There's so many people who need to hear your teachings. We don't have any teachers like you. And I need you. You saw things about me. You know where I lived. You used my house. Made my family part of yours for the evening. I want to get to know you better. And one of your 12 will betray you? Point him out. Who's the traitor? Let me at him. By that point, I was confused. I was angry. I didn't know what to think. And honestly, I'd lost my appetite. For a few minutes, the disciples went back to eating, but this time in silence. I don't think they knew what to say after what they just heard. But then he broke the silence again. He took some of the matzah, the bread that we had prepared that day without leaven to symbolize our hasty flight from Egypt. He gave thanks to God. He broke it and said, "Take, eat. This is my body." Your body? What do you mean, your body? I had no idea what he was talking about. And judging from the faces of his disciples, I don't think they did either. When the food was gone, it was time for the third of 4 glasses of wine served at this feast. He took the cup of wine again and prayed a prayer of thanksgiving and gave it to his disciples, and they drank from it. This is my blood of the new covenant, which is poured out for many. I know the sound of having drunk blood is strange, but that's not what I was thinking at the moment. He said his blood is poured out for many. I wasn't hearing things. That actually is the way he phrased it. Not something in the past or something in the future, but something in the present. And it as if he knew something was already in the works, like this traitor who he had spoken of was already to no good, and plans for his death were already underway. Like he was already dying. And poured out for many? What did he mean? It wouldn't all come together for me for another 24 hours. He thanked me as he left my house that evening. I walked back upstairs and sat down across from where he'd been sitting, the place of honor at the table where I normally sat. Is a place I would never sit in again. It would always be his. There in front of me where the bread and wine are in his words, his body and blood. What had just happened? Who was this Jesus, and Why had he seen fit to have the Passover in my house? In the weeks following that 24-hour period, I spent many hours in the upper room. It all came together for me. His body and his blood were about to be given for all mankind. They had been provided much as the Passover lamb and bread for our people's freedom had been given so many centuries before. What he had done at my table was a way of pointing to the sacrifice he was about to make. Passover was never again the same for our family. It couldn't be after what I witnessed that evening. And to think I was there. I witnessed the whole thing. I never would have dreamt that God would use my house and my life for such an extraordinary moment in time. I'm so glad I gave up my seat at the table. I'm so glad I didn't close the door when Jesus wanted to come to my house. Friends, Dr. Jean Edward Veith tells us some amazing things about the Lord's Supper that you and I experience in the here and the now, and we hope to experience again really soon. He reminds us God acts objectively through matter, embodying the gospel and promising forgiveness of sins. This is the real presence of Jesus. And we sometimes speak of searching for God, wishing we could have met Jesus, saying we could believe if only Christ would appear to us. And there he is in this meal. As we eat the bread, we are receiving in an intimate and personal way his body that was sacrificed on the cross 24 hours later after the meal he shared with his disciples. And when we drink the wine, we're receiving his blood that sealed the New Testament, guaranteeing the forgiveness of sins. We are united with Christ. Christ crucified, resurrected, and ascended. It's been said that this contact with Christ is more direct and closer and more intimate than what his disciples enjoyed on that very night. Because we get to have the body and blood, the bread and wine of Christ. See, Christ comes to us. It's not something we do, but it's something Jesus does, which we only have to receive. The Lord's Supper is nothing less than the gospel. And here's the good news for you and me as we are not able to partake in communion right now. We have the gospel, Jesus Christ, the Word of God that says he lived, died, and rose for you and me so that we would have forgiveness of sins forever. That promise, that hope is yours. So happy Maundy, Thursday. We'll talk to you soon.